I've changed my background to make you think that I'm hovering somewhere above the Danube Valley rather than at the University of Birmingham this week, in order to match our topic for the day, which is the Vetus Latina Institute. And behind me, you see the Archabbey of Beuron. The way this afternoon's session will work out, I'm going to give a brief introduction to the history of the Vetus Latina Institute and indeed talk a little bit about the significance of the Old Latin Bible. But I will try not to talk for too long because we have 7 panelists who are far more experienced than I am in both the ways of the Institute and the importance of studying the Old Latin, whose reminiscences we will enjoy listening to this afternoon as we celebrate 75 years since the founding of the Institute. So I'm going to try to share my screen, namely the PowerPoint. Share. And now slideshow, play from start. Keith, can you wave if you can see the PowerPoint working okay? Or Tony or Martin, good, thank you. So our round table to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Vetus Latina Institute. The Vetus Latina stands for Old Latin and is the collective name which is given to the earliest Latin translations of the Bible, made at some point around the year 180 up to the end of the 5th century. They were replaced by a version which later became standard or Vulgata, known as the Vulgate, which was devised towards the end of the 4th century and is associated with Jerome, although the first thing you're probably told after its association with Jerome is that Jerome was not responsible for the revision, and some books were revised according to different exemplars. In the Old Testament, he often followed Hebrew models, but in the Apocrypha, Greek models continued to be used. The Old Latin is important, though, because it was translated from an early form of the Septuagint, and so provides important textual information for that, as well as showing us the linguistic situation at the time, and indeed the textual situation of the transmission of both the Old Testament and the New Testament at the point that this version was initially translated and in its subsequent revisions. So the Vulgate is the latest standard, and texts which don't match the Vulgate standard are often referred to as Old Latin simply because all of the variant readings in the Latin tradition are often assumed at some point to go back to these earliest versions. And we start with the Vulgate because I have a wonderful picture here, thanks to Bonifatia Gesche, who is with us today, of the Stuttgart Vulgate team in 1969, this standard edition of the Vulgate produced by Weber, Thiele, Griebemont, Sparks and Fischer, and some of these faces you will see reappearing during the course of this afternoon and our panelists will be talking about. So the Vulgate is based on the thousands of standard manuscripts which survive of the Bible in Latin. And indeed in the Stuttgart Vulgate, a handful of very important manuscripts such as the Codex Amiatinus form the basis of that text. In the case of the Old Latin version, we are not so that we do some manuscripts of the direct tradition. I show you a couple on the left, but the majority of sources for the Old Latin Bible are from indirect tradition. It has to be reconstructed from quotations in early Christian writers, such as Jerome and Augustine, to piece together the biblical text that was known to them and how that's been transmitted over the course of the centuries. So this piecing together has followed the model of perhaps the biggest ever Latin dictionary, the Thesaurus Linguae Latinae, which was set up in the end of the 19th century in order to give a full account as possible of the history of the Latin language. And was developed on the basis of a large number of index cards. And you can see a few of these cards in the foreground, as well as the background of this picture of the Institute for the TLL. Now, the way of reconstructing the Old Latin Bible followed this as a model. A pastor called Joseph Denk in Munich started to collect under his own initiative the evidence for the Old Latin Bible on a series of index cards. These index cards were transferred to the Archabbey of St. Martin in Beuron towards the end of Denk's life, where another famous manuscript researcher, Alban Dolt, was among the brethren of the monastery. And on the basis of this collection of several tens, if not hundreds of thousands of index cards, an institute was founded in 1945, the Vetus Latina Institute, to work on a new complete edition of all of the surviving evidence for the Old Latin versions of each book of scripture. And the first director of this institute was the monk Bonifatia Fischer, who directed it almost for its first 30 years of being in action. And you see here Fischer with the boxes of index cards known as Zetteln for the actually in the monastery library in Beuron. And here is Fischer presenting his work on the edition to a very distinguished looking audience at an early stage in the life of the Vetus Latina Institute. He's showing here a page from the edition. Fischer was responsible for the first book to be published in the series, which rather appropriately was the book of Genesis. And this shows the layout which has become standard, that at the top third of the page, you have a schema of text types reconstructed from all of the individual pieces of evidence. Then in the middle of the page, there's a critical apparatus giving you the reading of each of the witnesses to the word of the verse. And then at the bottom, a full listing of the quotations and indeed the manuscript readings for that verse in the witness apparatus. So this presentation, a tripartite division of the page, shows the complexity of trying to reconstruct from the little evidence which remains the forms of text that may have been current in Latin Christian circles in the 3rd and 4th centuries and so on. In addition to the volumes of the edition, there is an accompanying book series, Aus der Geschichte der lateinischen Bibel, from the history of the Latin Bible, in which a number of companion volumes have been published. So Fischer set up the edition, he set up this book series, and then he was followed by his colleague Hermann Josef Freder as the second director of the Institute, who was responsible for the edition of the later Pauline epistles. And he also worked closely with the theologian Walter Thiele, who edited the Catholic epistles, the Wisdom of Solomon, the first part of Sirach. And you see him here in the Institute library holding up some images of the huge collection of manuscript images collected by the Institute. The third director of the Institute was the Belgian scholar Roger Grison, who was director until 2014. Professor Grison is still alive and very much regrets that he can't join us this afternoon due to other commitments, but he sends his good wishes to participants. And Professor Grison made two significant changes or developments during the course of the history of the Institute. He arranged for the scanning of the index cards. So now we have hundreds of thousands, if not a million index cards stored by the Vetus Latina Institute, and you see two of them at the bottom. And these were photographed and have been put online by Brepols publishers. And so the raw material collected in the library and available for the subscription to search for textual scholarship. So the Vetus Latina database is an important way of virtually visiting Beuron. And the second innovation which Grison introduced was the appointment of corresponding editors for the Vetus Latina Institute. So colleagues who are working on books of reconstructing the text of books, not based in Beuron, but in other parts of the world. And you will see some of them on here. And I'm delighted that certainly the two on the left are on our panel today to talk about their work on the Old Latin Bible. The current director of the Institute is Professor Thomas Johann Bauer, who is also with us today. And Professor Bauer has the task of bringing the Institute further into the digital age than it has ever been before, such as the institution of a Twitter account just last week for the Vetus Latina Institute. So after this session, you can follow the latest news and indeed some of the history of the Institute on this Twitter account. So I thought I would show you where the stage of the edition currently is. In green, I've highlighted books which have been completed, while in orange or yellow, you can see the books which are currently in progress, perhaps with some fascicles having been published. So it gives you a sense of the work that has been completed over the last 75 years. And the work which is still to come and currently ongoing, and showing that even after 75 years, the model adopted by the Institute and the importance of this material is such that it is the focus of a considerable ongoing endeavours. The number of useful websites, I haven't listed the Twitter account here, but there's the official website of the Institute, the links to manuscripts, texts and material from some of the projects which are involved in gathering material in an electronic form in order to make that available. And at the very bottom, I've discovered a YouTube account which is posting archive footage of the history of the Vetus Latina Institute. So if you want to watch the laying of the foundation stone, or indeed hear Bonifatia's Fischer, the founder, speak, these are excellent things to follow up. I was going to try and show them after this session, but I discovered you only see the images and not the sound. So I recommend watching these later after our session today. So let us enter the Institute library at Beuron. That's how it looked in the 1960s. And photograph I have from 2016 shows that it hasn't changed a large amount in the intervening period. And this is a working environment which will be very familiar to our 7 panelists today. So here are our panelists, and I would invite unmute yourselves, panelists, to introduce yourself briefly and say what your experience, what your connection is with the Vetus Latina Institute, and then to hear something of your memories of the people with whom you've worked there. So Bonifatia, I see that you are unmuted. Would you like to speak?
Okay, hello. So I'm Sister Bonifatia Gesche. Actually, I did a PhD in Assyriology before I entered the monastery. But when, well, they didn't know what to do with an Assyriologist in Mariendonk in my monastery. And so they decided to let me work on the Vetus Latina, which has a long tradition in Mariendonk. So that's me. At the moment, I'm working on the Ezra books, and I'm also involved in a synopsis on Sirach. That's why I'm also very familiar with this book. I think that's enough for introducing myself.
Thank you. Tony, would you like to introduce yourself? You need to unmute your microphone before you speak. You need to click on the button on the left. Ulrich, perhaps could you unmute yourself while Tony finds the correct button? Thank you.
Yeah. You want me to speak?
Yes, tell us about how you're associated with the Old Latin. Tony, if you can unmute yourself, do speak.
Yeah, my name is Ulrich Schmid. When I was working on my doctoral thesis in the early 1990s, reconstructing the Pauline corpus that is ascribed to Marcion, I had to work a lot with Vetus Latina materials, especially with the editions that Frede had produced. And when I finished my thesis, I sent him, that was actually the idea of Barbara Allen, so I sent him a copy of my book, and I received a letter of which I'm proud of by him, that he actually liked it. And later on, when working on gospel harmony tradition, I came to visit the Vetus Latina Institute and to meet Frede and Fischer and others in person. That was in 1997. That's all for the moment, I think.
Thank you. Tony, I can see you're unmuted.
I'm
Speak.
unmuted. I was doing it with my finger. You have to do it with the mouse. Okay. Okay. Tony Forte. I have been in Rome for the last 30 years teaching Greek and Latin and a little bit of textual criticism in Roman history. And I just finished a sabbatical, which means that I'm just about done with my next fascicule that Sister Bonifatia is helping me go through, and she's seen a lot of mistakes, so she's very helpful. What I wanted to say was I came to Bauer. I never heard of Bauer until I took a seminar with Professor Löfstedt at Los Angeles, where I got my PhD at UCLA. And he said, but before you go, make sure you address your letter to Professor Dr. Herr, what was his name? Bauer,
Frede.
Sorry?
Was it Professor Frede?
Frede, that was his name. So I wrote to him, Professor Doctor, and he wrote back saying, you're most welcome to come. So I got there and he looked at me and he said, if you make one mistake, if you get one of these zettel out of order, I will destroy you. So I was a little bit taken back by that, but I saw another aspect. These are just personal anecdotes. He told me, and I want you out of here every day at 4 o'clock. You can come in at 9 and you must be out at 4. So I didn't say anything, but when he went away, another monk came to me and said, oh, don't listen to him. He said, I'll make sure you get in back into the library at 4 o'clock. He leaves and goes back home. So that was my first contact. But Frede was very, very polite and kind also. Just that first element. So as I said, as we said, Sirac is what I've been doing, and it's by far the most difficult task I've ever had, and probably the most difficult textual criticism wise, because the text is so, you know, chapter 5 verse 10 in Greek is chapter 6 verse 11 in Latin, that type of thing. So even just constructing the schemata was a huge task, and I've done that for the whole book. I've done the whole book's Zeugenapparat, and the most crucial part of the text is, of course, the critical apparatus, and that's what I'm working on now.
Thank you very much. Martin Kaller, I see you're unmuted, so would you tell us of your association with the Institute?
Also Martin Karrer from Wuppertal. I'm doing the ECM in Revelation, and before I worked on the translation of the Septuagint. At that time we often looked for the Vetus Latina, and we met, for example, Mrs. Schulz-Flügel. I can't see her here, but I think it is similar as Roger Grisson, who is knowing them. Can imagine. It is.
Eva sends her best to everyone.
Genau.
Okay.
Also, and then we hold a conference on the Vetus Latina in 2016 in Wuppertal. And that was a kind of friendship which evolved there. And we are very happy working with Thomas Johann Bauer now for the, for doing help and for finding ways for the future of the Vetus Latina. And I bring the greetings of that circle of friends.
Thank you, Martin. Professor Bauer, you're next on my list, and although I have introduced you, would you say hello and greet us?
Hello to everyone. I should also greet everyone from the responsibles of the Vetus Latina Foundation, the publisher Manuel Herder, the Archabbot Tutilo, and Professor Prostmeier from University Freiburg, who can't take part today, but told me to greet everyone. I'm responsible for the Institute and the work on the edition since 2014. I was asked to be ready to do this job 1 year before in 2013, and after some thinking I decided to do it. And now I'm responsible for the future of the Institute and seeking ways to how the work can be changed and can be done also under different conditions today. I'm working together with Professor Annette Weißenrieder on the edition of Luke, and we also started to do some work on Matthews because the material is closely connected, and we think it makes sense to have a look on both materials because we have to do it anyway, and so we can start both editions. But we still are looking for the funding of the work, and we have somebody responsible to help us with the with applying for grants, and we hope we will be successful in the near future. I think that is everything I can say at the moment, and I am ready to answer questions later on the future of the Institute as far as I'm able to do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're delighted that you're able to be here today. Thank you very much for joining us. Tom, could you unmute yourself and tell us a little about your connection with the Institute, please?
Hello, I'm Tom O'Loughlin, and I teach theology in the University of Nottingham in Britain. When I was doing research as a research assistant to a man called Maurice Sheehy, who had hoped to produce a harmony of pre-Carolingian canon law texts, which are full of biblical quotations, very few of which were in the manuscripts that I was dealing with identical with the standard edition of the Vulgate. In those days, it was the 2-volume green edition we were using. So it became clear to me that to try and see what was happening, it was necessary to go to Bauer. So I arrived in Bauer sometime in the late 80s. I've been trying to work out the exact year, but I can't do that with precision, but I think it was either 87 or 88. And I just found it a treasure trove. And then when I went to do my doctorate, I was looking at the evolution of Genesis commentaries from the time of Augustine to the Carolingians. And I had a theory about how this evolution was taking place. And I realized that it would either stand or fall by work I would do in Bauer. So, and luckily I think, well, it succeeded. To my mind, no one has taken me out on it since. But my experience of arriving in Bauer is the exact opposite of Tony Forte's. I seem to be the one person who found a charming Freda and an incredibly helpful Freda. So I'll give more reminiscences later.
Thank you very much, Tom. Keith, I've left you till last because I think we established earlier this week that you probably made the first visit out of our entire panel to Beuron. So tell us about that and your connection with the Institute.
Yes, well, I went actually for the first time then in 1966. I repeat, 1966. I was studying then for my doctorate in Oxford, and my Dr. Forte was the Canadian Professor George Kilpatrick, who was the Dean Ireland professor at the time, the New Testament professor in Oxford. And he thought I ought to, as I was doing a doctorate on the pastoral epistles, I ought to spend some time in Münster and some time in Beuron. So I went to Beuron in March '66. I can mention later my contacts with Fischer and with Freda and with Thiele and others. But I think sufficient to say Beuron isn't an easy place to get to, as I was discovering last year, actually, having taught in Stuttgart. There are many Haltstationen, as it says on the in the song about Auf der Schwäbische Eisenbahn. And it's a slow journey to get from Tübingen, which is where I'd been last year, down to Stuttgart, then Stuttgart to somewhere else, Ulm probably, and then along the Danube Valley, but a few trains do actually stop at the little village in Bauer, and I was familiar with the photograph of 1966 that you were showing earlier, Hugh. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to share some reminiscences, which I'll do shortly. But originally, I think your plan was that we would be at the SNTS meeting in Rome, which of course is, like many a conference, been postponed or cancelled. And actually, as some of you may know, I'm not only interested in matters text critical, but also the Apocrypha. And I thought this year I ought to attend the apocryphal seminars, and you're not supposed to jump around between one seminar and another. So this is a good opportunity to say a few things about the Vetus Latina experience, which I'm now able to give, but wouldn't have been had I been going to the Rome meeting. Well, that's sufficient for now, I think, Hugh, isn't it?
Well, indeed, and this online presentation does mean that we're very glad to have you among our panelists. So tell us some reminiscences from visiting the Institute in 1966 and the people you met then.
Okay, then, well, I'll kick off. I did meet Bonifatius Fischer, who was, of course, directing the Institute at that time, and also the two main German scholars who were also working. There was Frede, and there was the Protestant Walter Thiele, who was teaching at the evangelical faculty in Tübingen at that time, 1 day a week, I think. So there were the three of them there at that time. When I first arrived, I crossed over and was met by the Hausvater at the Institute, which is a huge building, as you'll see behind Hugh here, a huge building in a very small village. So when I went last year, I was pleasantly surprised that piles of people go along for the High Mass on a Sunday from all sorts of villages and towns that are in easy distance, traveling distance to Bauer. But Bauer itself is a very small settlement, really, with the Hotel Pelican. I was pleased to see still exists, because I'd remembered in '66, not only did this coincide with Lent, but it also coincided with my birthday. And I went along to celebrate my birthday. As long as I got back, not at 4 a.m. as Tony was saying, but 4 p.m., but 9 p.m., which was the end of the curfew for the people who were actually living in the Gastflügel at that time, the guest wing. But the father who'd met me showed me this guest wing, told me all the times, but it was very apologetic. He thought Lent wouldn't be a good time to experience the benefits of the catering in the monastery. In practice, of course, they did eat extremely well, even during Lent, and apart from it being my birthday, it was also St. Benedict's Day at that time. I think it was altered by the Roman Catholic authorities in 1969, but in 1966, it always fell, or typically fell, in Lent. And that was an opportunity for the monks there to release their normal prohibition on what they could and couldn't do for Lent. And consequently, we ate exceptionally well, not just every day of the week, but especially on Benedict's own birthday. I think that's possibly all I need to say at this stage, but we will want to go on to the time of Grisson and his French-speaking Belgian colleagues, Jean-Claude Elliott and Maurice Bogaert, both of whom I know quite well. Bogaert and Elliott and Grisson, who seemed to be quite a workaholic, I thought, worked quickly and got out the Apocalypse of John, and he got out the Isaiah volumes. Elliott seems to be working equally quickly. He and Bogaert have recently concluded the Judith volumes, and Elliott is now working on the books of Daniel, or the book of Daniel, parts of Daniel, having also completed Esther and Mark's Gospel recently. And then, despite Grisson's prohibitions, and I do have the foreword that he wrote, the avant-propos to the last volumes that he was responsible for, they were censored by the committee, but I do have the originals. And it's now returned to, not to Swabia, but at least to Germany. And Thomas Bauer, who's here with us, teaches, I think, in Erfurt University, when he's not actually at Bauer. It'll be useful, I think, to hear what has actually changed over the years. I did go on a Sunday last year, but not into the monastery proper. I did go into the church, and I did have my Sunday lunch in the Pelican, but I didn't actually see what was happening within the monastery itself. I understand that the Vetus Latina library has been moved. Perhaps we can hear about that. And all the Zetteln are, of course, now available online through the Brepols organization that we heard about from Hugh earlier. But it would be interesting to know just how essential it is for anybody to, except for the director, of course, to attend anything in Bauer itself.
Well, if I can come in on the back of that,
Yes,
and say that when at Birmingham, we were hoping to start work on the Vetus Latina of John, and my colleagues David Parker and Philip Burton contacted Professor Grison to say, could we meet perhaps come over to Boiron and meet you? And he said that there is no point in going to Boiron. You can do all you need from a distance, which is why my visit to Boiron this afternoon is entirely virtual, and I have no pictures of my own to show. Now, Tom, you visited slightly later after Keith, but you still found it a very active institute at the time, I think.
Yes, Bonifatius Fischer had retired from the institute when I went to work there, but he was still a presence, and he was still you could meet up with him. And since I was working on Genesis, chatting to him about his edition of Genesis was wonderful. I'm just delighted to hear what Keith said about Hotel Pelican, because I think for anyone who ever worked in Boiron, the Hotel Pelican was just as important as the laboratory of the institute itself. And when I was driving, I don't know where I was going. 2 years ago, I was driving in that, and I thought, I can make a deviation to Boiron. And I was very sad to see that the Hotel Pelican had been, the family that had run it had cleared off, and it was looking very dilapidated. And I just thought, I'm delighted to hear that Pelican is open again. I wrote to Freda, and I was told to arrive on a Monday morning at 9 o'clock. And I arrived at the door of the monastery, and a big monk was in the little cubbyhole and said, "What do you want?" And I said, "I want to see Professor Freda." And he said, "You want to see Professor Dr. Freda?" And he said, "He doesn't see anyone before 10 o'clock. Come back at 10 o'clock. And I think I passed one of the most fearful hours of my life in a room in Pelican waiting for this ogre to appear. So at exactly 10 o'clock, I met Freda, and he couldn't have been, he said, "Why do you need this institute?" And I told him why I thought it would be useful. And he said, "Excellent, you will need a place to sit down." And there's a window there in one of your pictures. That was the very window I sat at. And it was, I visited it nearly every summer from then until 1996, and tried to spend either a week or a fortnight there. And Freda was invariably helpful. Tila was utterly charming. Eva Schutzflügel went past at high speed and smiled, and that was it. But Freda and Tila were terribly interested in anything you were turning up. And it was delightful to see those strange little cardboard boxes that the cards were in. I had forgotten they came in that, but it was the other interesting thing about being in Boiron was that if you wanted to check, this is pre-internet, if you wanted to check a text, all the texts were in the same place. CSEL, CC, PL, you could find any text and read the sentence in a matter of seconds, whereas in any other library, these were scattered. And it brings back very, very happy memories to me. I could keep going on, but I've said enough for the time being.
Thank you, Tom. Tony, would you like to tell us more about when your meeting, your early meetings at the monastery, or would you like to talk a little bit more about the work you've done in your edition?
Well, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Good. I went there to work. I was working on a commentary on the Gospel of Matthew by a certain Frigolos, and I just published it last year finally. But I went there for that purpose, and during that time, it was in August. Grison comes. He used to come the whole month of August. The few years he was in charge, and he looked at me and said, "Well, do you want to do something really serious?" And I said, "Well, what do you suggest?" He said, "Thiele has he's resigned. He's 82, 5, I don't know." And he said, "But he's finished the first half of Sirach. He did a long introduction and 24 chapters." He said, "We need someone to do chapter 25 to 52." And he said, "I could show you how it goes." And he said, "Even better, Professor Thiele wants to meet you and wants to show you." So that's really the best part of it, was working with Thiele for about 4 years. Once a week I would, this is now 4 years in the summers, I would go to his home in Sigmaringen and have coffee and cake, and he would explain what a Zeugenapparat is, what a Kleinapparat, and he would warn me about the use of the Zettel, saying that not all of them are of any interest. You might have 1 or 2 words in the Zettel text, patristic text, that has something to do with Sirach, but he said, be careful, don't just throw all these Zeugen together. But one of the things I noticed is that he started to get very sick after a couple of years, I don't remember. And he told me that he had to help me get to a certain point. He said, because no one else can. And then he said, no, there is someone else. There's Eva Schutzflügel. He said, she knows a lot. And if you look at his apparatus, in it, he often quotes her. So he says, as she told me once. So anyway, it became a commentary, and his apparatus became a commentary and a commentary. But really knowing Thiele helped very, very much. And I got to know his daughter, and we're still very friendly. But anyway, the important thing is that there was a place where one could work, and despite the limitations that Freda wanted to put on me, I was able to make good use of the space I was given. So that I went there a couple of years ago, or 2 years ago, 3 years ago maybe, and it wasn't the same. The library doesn't exist anymore. Professor Bauer can tell us, I just heard that the books have been taken from the Institute and put into the library of the monastery. And I don't know if that's true, but that's what I was told. So.
Well, I'm sure we'll hear more about that later. Before we have our more general questions, though, I think it'd be a good time to turn to Bonifatia and hear about your work on the edition. You've talked about how it relates to some of your other academic interests, but can you tell us more about the process of putting together a Vetus Latina edition?
Well, I visited the Institute several times, but I didn't work as most of the other members of this panel for a couple of days or something like this. I met Professor Thiele and Eva Schulz-Flügel and Father Hugo and so on. But actually, the main work I did in Mariendonk, sitting alone on my desk with more or less the help of Professor Grison. It worked while he introduced me to this, explained me how to do it, and left for that was it. after this, I tried to figure out how it worked, sent him my work, and he sent it back with lots and lots of corrections. It was usually not very friendly comments and so on, but very helpful comments. So it went on for quite some time. I tried to get into it, and also eventually I finished my first edition on Ruth. I think at that time I didn't even know what the Vetus Latina was. I mean, I was able to explain it, but even introduced visitors to it and so on. But I'm not sure if I really was aware of the importance of the whole thing and so on. After this, I started with the Ezra books, and this was also quite interesting. And in the end, I think also the crucial point of my work on the Vetus Latina, well, it worked like this. I got the Professor Crison organized a couple of photographs or photocopies of manuscripts. First of all, the one well known, but he also checked some catalogs and sent me some additional manuscripts as well. I would say something like 10 additional manuscripts, and then I just started to work on this. I worked and worked, and the text was a bit strange. I had the impression that it was not actually the oldest text. There were some gaps in it. It just didn't fit, but it was still just a feeling. As I said, at that time I was not really aware what I was doing. But I finished my first fascicle after about 3 years, and then I thought, I had looked through all the manuscripts Crison had provided. Most of them were just the Paris Bible, lots of mistakes, not very interesting, but I finished the first 80 pages, but then I thought you have to look at the manuscripts again. Obviously I had to do this, and this is actually what I did. I looked at it, had a very badly written manuscript from Spain, and suddenly I found out this is exactly what was missing all the time. Gave all the answers I had when I did the edition. So at that, I think this was really the crucial point, because I can really point it to this moment that I understood what I was doing. It took, well, it was just before and after this. So, well, then I sent a letter to Crison. I think I've got a problem. I've finished the whole edition, but there's a new version of the text, and I think I have to go through it and do it all again. I mean, that was not that much of a work. It took me half a year, something like this, but actually this was how I was introduced to the Vetus Latina. And after this, he also, well, freed me. So he said, from now on, I can publish without showing him the stuff. And then I also went out and went to conferences and so on. I think, but also this point when I understood what was going on, this also determined my specific field of interest in the Vetus Latina, which is mostly the text critical part. For me, it is really important to see the Bible as a whole with all the different versions, of which the Vetus Latina is only one. I mean, it's one beside the Septuagint, beside the Hebrew text, and it is really interesting and important to put all this stuff together. I mean, questions how the Old Latin Bible represents maybe even the oldest text of the Hebrew Bible, which is not preserved anymore. These are questions which are really interesting, and also the Syriac tradition and so on. to put all this together and try to find out how it worked, what was the text, how the text developed, and so on. This, I think, this interest started at this moment. That's, I think, also why I'm so interested also in Septuagint studies, and I also like to do Hebrew studies and so on. Well, I think this is my way to the to being an editor of the Vetus Latina. I had some nice meetings with Thiele, but at the beginning he didn't understand my beginner's questions, so I couldn't do much with his answers. I mean, I got wonderful letters, but it took me ages to understand his answers, because he was just not aware that someone could know as little as I did when I started. But well, things developed by the time.
Super, thank you very much indeed. And that gives us a really good introduction into the importance of the Old Latin in terms of the Old Testament. I wonder if Ulrich or Martin would like to talk about the significance of the Old Latin within books of the New Testament, or indeed more reflections on the importance of Old Latin versions.
I just wanted to talk a little about Hermann Josef Frede. There's something which he told me, and it might be interesting to our listeners. I mean, he was a soldier during World War II, and he was actually riding an airplane, an aircraft, and he told me that he was so impressed by actually witnessing the Allied invasion of Italy. So he was riding this reconnaissance plane, or reconnaissance. How is this pronounced?
Yes, reconnaissance.
Reconnaissance, and so he was flying across the Mediterranean in this area, and he saw these huge amounts of boats, ships, carriers, and everything. And that was actually in September '43, and he was convinced by then that this was a complete and utter disaster for Germany to move on with the war. So he was convinced that despite any claims to the contrary, this was a lost war. And when he told this story to us, he was actually still moved by this experience that he had, how it dawned on him on this trip. I don't know, it was something, I don't know how he came to talk about that, but was something I remember very vividly. So now talking about the importance of the Vetus Latina for the New Testament, I mean, I would rather not look at it just from the Vetus Latina point of view, but from the Latin Bible point of view in more general. The Latin Bible, on the one hand, the Vetus Latina extends into the tradition of the Latin Bible throughout the Middle Ages, because the Vulgate essentially is also one kind of Vetus Latina text. And when working with Vetus Latina material and Latin Bible text in general, it took me some time to realize that this distinction between Vulgate on the one hand as a monolithic entity that can easily be juxtaposed against Vetus Latina and other more ancient versions, and kind of ignore the Vulgate tradition. That's a really big mistake. So I would rather look at the Latin tradition as a whole and look at it in terms of how it became the powerhouse of post-Roman, post-late antique culture in Western Europe, and that's really what came to interest me more in the last years, so to speak.
Great, thank you very much. We're getting quite close to the advertised end time. So Martin, if you have some words, then I'll ask Thomas Johann Bauer if he would like to respond to anything that's been said. And people who are interested in asking questions, if you start to indicate those in the chat facility, we'll give you the opportunity to ask questions later. But so Martin, tell us about the importance of the Vetus Latina to you.
Yes, also the importance of the Vetus Latina, and perhaps a kind of dream, since we are now at the point where it's coming the future. The importance you ask for the Vetus Latina and New Testament. And I must say, I use the Vetus Latina in a double direction. The first direction is as a daughter of the Greek translation for reconstructing and for knowing the old text. And the other direction is the fascinating apparatus of the church fathers. There you have a kind of reception history, and you get first impressions, how was that text used? And since I'm working on Revelation, you must say the Vetus Latina was in use very long, and therefore it is very important to see, for example, the Beatus, that is an interpretation, and Roger Grisson reconstructed, in fact, a kind of reception history too. So I see the culture of Western Europe, of our own traditions there, and I like that apparatus. What I'm dreaming, therefore, that my dream would be go in two directions. The one direction would be working together in the future by the electronic ways, and that means all the editions of the Bible. Also, you know, there are the Vetus Latina, the Septuagint, the New Testament in Münster, Septuagint, and Coptic text in Göttingen. And the New Testament edition is done now electronically. The Vetus Latina perhaps will be done electronically in future. I asked Thomas Bauer, we spoke of it, and it would be a dream to work together. The Septuaginta Göttingensis will work in the future by electronic media. With Dr. Albrecht and Dr. Feder, Ulrich Schmid is working with the Coptic edition. Therefore, it would be possible to do a network of editions that would need something like similar sigla, a similar use of lectionaries and so on. But that's the work we can start and do in future.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's my main dream, to work together.
Great, thank you. Tom, you wanted to come in on something.
I'd just like to add 3 footnotes, which it would be dreadful if we had this meeting and they weren't mentioned. Bonifatia mentioned Pater Hugo, who was no longer actually working on a text when I visited the Institute, but used to go in every day and was a charming presence who grew plants all around the floor of the Institute, and you had to watch out that you didn't tip over. He showed me how to cut little bits off a plant and plant it so that you got another plant, and I've done that ever since, and I think of Pater Hugo every time I do this in the garden. The second thing, the second footnote is, there was one person who never gets mentioned. He gets one footnote in this book, which we all know, and that was, of course, Herbert Stanjak, who Freda would shout out of his office, "Stanjak," and the poor guy used to run to his office. And I see Ulrich Schmid smiling. I'm sure you remember this as well. And if you needed to get a collection of cards, he would bring them to you. So he became everyone's research assistant while you were there. He must be still alive, because Grisson thanks him in his new comment, in his edition, the new edition he's just produced of a commentary on the Apocalypse. But wherever Herbert Stanjak is, we all those of us who visited there, I'm sure, remember him with great fondness. And of course, the last thing is, this in itself has revolutionized patristic scholarship, because many places now insist that in footnotes you use the codes that were invented by Fisher and then later codified by Freda. So this in itself, quite apart from anything to do with the biblical text, has been a wonderful boon to patristics. And I insist, for instance, in my series, that anyone who's quoting a text mentioned here uses this format rather than endlessly inventing new abbreviations for texts. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. And I gather from the messages that it's important to mention Staniek. Didn't you say there's something about a bicycle that he used to use?
I don't remember. I remember he had a red Mercedes, because he gave me a lift to Sigmaringen in it once.
Yeah, right, thank you. So Thomas, Johann, over to you. And then I think Tony wants to say something. We're already getting some questions. So do also address questions about the origin of the Vetus Latina as you speak, as well as talking perhaps about what you see as future directions for the Institute.
Okay, I think I should say some words on the future of the Institute, as far as I'm able to do that at the moment. There has been some words already in this panel about the library, the Institute itself, and it is true that things have changed. The library is transferred to the monastery library, and also the material is transferred to the monastery library. The reasons are reconstructions and restructuring at the monastery of Beuron. The building where the Institute has been up to now is not in best shape anymore, and there has to be done something with this building, and changes have to be made, and that affects us. It is also true that work is changing there. Houghton mentioned something about that also during the time of Cresson, and it is not possible to change everything again. I am bound by things that have been done under Cresson, and I can't change them at the moment. We are trying to change some things. I try to make the Institute more visible again than it has been during the last years. I want to give the impression that we are still alive, because we are alive, and I hope we will be alive for a long time, for many years to come. And I'm also convinced that the Institute will be working as long as it is necessary to complete the edition, and we are doing our best to complete the edition. There has also been some words on the kind of how the introduction to the work on the edition has been in the years until Cresson, and I think everyone here knows and can imagine that it is not possible anymore to do the work how it has been done, the years before. You cannot tell somebody, okay, start working, I will tell you that everything is wrong until you know how to do things. And maybe it will take 5 years, it will take 10 years or 15 years, and then we can start the editions. Nobody will pay us for that. They will give us the funding to work like that. I'm trying at the moment to create possibilities for younger scholars to get used with the work on the edition and to know something about the Vetus Latina edition. I hope I will be able to tell something about that in the next Arbeitsbericht of the Institute in 2 years. And I also hope that applications for fundings of projects will be successful and can be mentioned in the next Arbeitsbericht. But on the other hand, at the moment, I don't know how the actual Corona crisis will affect funding and the work of institutions like the Vetus Latina Institute. I don't think there will be as much money anymore for projects like the Vetus Latina or other edition projects as it has been until this year. What else can I say? I'm not that lucky that I do know all the persons responsible for the institute, because I'm too young to know Bonifatius Fischer or Frede. I've met Croissant and some others from the institute that has been working, who have been working there. What else can I say about the institute? We will find ways to make the material accessible for the persons working on the Old Latin edition. The Denkkasten, the cards with the citations and the all the testimonies and all the evidence are available via Prepos. I'm a bit concerned because many people use the cards and write that this is the Vetus Latina without knowing what the material in reality is. And I think there are many mistakes using the cards, and some people don't even know that it is some kind of raw material. It has to be checked on the manuscripts, it has to be checked on the editions, and you even have to check it if it is Old Latin, or even if it is a verse of a certain book of the Bible mentioned on the card, because it is just some things to start the work with. And many people don't know that and use the cards without any sense about what the Vetus Latina really is. And I think that is a problem, and we will have to find ways to make it more, to give a better idea about Vetus Latina, about the edition, about how to work with the editions. Also, some people there are mistakes in thinking about the schema of on the top of the pages. It is not claiming that it is the text how it has been. It is only giving some kind of line, some kind of impression how to read all the evidences, how to use all the evidences, but it's not claiming that this is the text how it has been at a certain point of the time. I think all these things are difficult and we will have to do some work, but I am sure we'll find ways to make the Institute more alive again and more present and maybe even more interesting for scholars as present here.
Well, thank you very much. And the fact also that we had more than 50 people able to join in and hear not only about the Institute, but also about these new initiatives. And I'm sure you will soon have many more than 50 followers of Twitter, and the information you can disseminate that way as well will be very valuable. But the fact also that it's so much easier to have access to images of manuscripts and to be able to log into Prepos and see the cards wherever you are. There is a connection now, which there hasn't been before. Now, we do have a couple of questions. We have a number of questions which are coming up in chat. Jeff Kate, are you happy for me to, if I unmute you to ask your question, then if members of the panel want to unmute themselves to talk about what the origins of the Vetus Latina might be?
Sure. Thank you, Hugh, and thank you, panelists. This is truly fascinating work. And I hesitate to ask this question because it's so complex, hours could be spent on it. So I don't want to hog our remaining time, but maybe a brief word about what they've seen about the origins of the Vetus Latina. I asked there in the chat, our standard introductions of New Testament textual criticism, like the Alliance text, and then Metzger and Ehrman, they make it sound like the Latin translation early on was done multiple times separately, independently. They say that based on statements from Augustine and Jerome. But it sounds like there's a growing consensus from Latin scholars that the Vetus Latina derives from a single source early on. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts on this is and what you've seen as you've worked directly with the Vetus Latina manuscripts.
I think the simplest answer is to say you should read Hugh's book.
Yes.
Because I think he has more or less given it's a very fine introduction that answers that exact question. And yes, you're right. Everyone took that famous line from De Doctrina Christiana, and they just assumed that Augustine was a textual scholar.
Yeah, I agree about Hugh's text on the Latin New Testament. In fact, that's where I really became well acquainted with that understanding. And since I work more just with Greek textual criticism, I'm afraid that some in textual criticism of the New Testament don't realize this because they haven't worked. They take at face value what Augustine and Jerome had said, and then it's repeated by Metzger, Urban, Alans, and such. Thank you, Tom.
I want to add to that, to ask Bonifatia and Tony, because the information I put in that book is based on the observations of people who have been, of the Vetus Latina editors. And to hear Bonifatia say that she felt something was missing from, I can't remember if it was Luther or Esdras, and it was only when you found the Spanish manuscript you realized that was the earlier form you'd been looking for, or that you got a sense that the evidence that was there pointed to a particular text that you were trying to, that made sense of the evidence that survived.
Sorry, I can't hear very badly because the internet connection is so bad. I got only every second word what you said. I'm trying, but I think you were talking about the why I thought this other text, a manuscript, gave an older text.
Yes, but also the idea that this text is that things go back to a single Latin version, which makes sense of the evidence you have before you, even in the Old Testament books.
I mean, I'm not familiar with the New Testament at all, so I can speak only for the Old Testament. And for me, it's so hard to conclude for sure. But I think you see a development of the text. If you have a completely new translation, it looks different. You don't see a development. Let's say you can, not always, but sometimes you can distinguish a translation by a church father who did the translation by himself from the actual biblical text. So I mean, that shows that you have multiple ways to translate the single Vorlage. And this, you would see this if you had the manuscripts, the text traditions, I would say. I mean, the Ezra books don't have so many, such a long development. I mean, I've got these 2 or 3 different kinds of books, but I think it's even more clear in Sirach, where you can go back to the African text, which you can see that the Vulgate text, which is the Old Latin text in this case, follows the African text, and you can see that the later versions from Spain and other regions go edit the text again against the Greek Vorlage and so on. So it doesn't look like different versions, especially when you compare it to translations which are made individually. But actually, this is really a point. Can we be sure that this is true for all the biblical books?
Maybe we only when the editions have been made, and that brings us nicely onto Marie Fry's question. If I unmute Marie Fry, you had a question to ask about whether there were some books which might not be published, or the most difficult books still to be done.
Yes, I had a question about the book of Job, on which I'm working in Lyon at the Source Chrétienne. And it seems to me it's so very difficult to reconstruct the text, also for the Vulgate, also for Old Latin, so I will know if this is a kind of text that may never be published. Thanks.
Thank you. Do any panelists have thoughts? Thomas, Johann, are there books which make you quail when you think about how they might be edited?
I cannot answer about the book of Job at the moment. We are not planning the edition at the moment. Nobody asks to do it at the moment. And we have other stuff to do right now. I think there are books that are problems. I think Psalms are a problem, how to do the work. And there also will be questions how to decide to do the editions, because we have many different types. That is much more complicated than questions that have to be answered in the schema up to now, because we don't have one Psalter, we have different versions, and how to deal with the different forms of the Psalter in an edition, which forms we have to include in the edition. I don't know that at the moment. We will see how to do it as soon as we start the Psalter, but we are willing to do it someday. And I think there will be a way to do it. I also think it will be difficult how to do the edition of Matthews, because of the huge quantity of material that have to be included in the edition, if we follow the principle that all testimonies are included in the edition, that you can find every citation that is Old Latin in the first millennium. And everybody here, I think, know how many citations of Matthews there are. And I don't know how to do that at the moment, but I'm also sure we will find a way how to do it. And I think we are willing to complete the edition for every book, but I can't tell when we will do it. I don't have any timetable. There was a timetable once, many years ago, and if the timetable would have been able to be followed, the edition would be completed now, and you would have in front of you the whole Vetus Latina. I think we have also other tasks within the edition or within the work of the Institute to do before thinking about completing the edition. I think it is necessary to give some kind of general induction to the edition to explain how the edition works. There are some materials by Bonifacio Fischer and some publications on the work of the edition, but we don't have anything like a general introduction. I think a general introduction at the moment will be preliminary. It will have to be replaced during the work by new editions of these introduction. And also to come back to the questions about one or many translations at the beginning, the Institute does not have a certain position about that we claim that there is one translation at the beginning, and that translation has been transformed over the years. Every editor has to decide based on the material he is working with whether there is one single translation, or he thinks or she thinks that there is one translation at the basis of the Vetus Latina, or whether there are more than one. Up to now, almost all editors decided that on their point of view, there is only one translation at the beginning, but the translations starting at different times, and there are different ways how the translation for single books started. At the moment, the colleague Professor Blümer, working on Acts, has announced that on his opinion, there are more than one translation of the Acts at the beginning of the Old Latin tradition of the Latin text of Acts. We will see which are his arguments. On the other hand, we can look at the research during the 19th century, and there was always a shift between one single translation at the beginning or many translations at the beginning. And I think considering the history of research, we also might be aware that we will never really know how the beginnings of the Old Latin tradition have been. I'm a bit skeptical whether we can decide it is this way. If I look at texts from the Gospel of Luke, the overall impression might be that the simplest explanation is to think of one translation of the beginning that has been transformed on certain principles. Different Greek manuscripts, a change in Greek manuscripts, changes in the vocabulary of the Latin Church, and the technique of translations may explain many observations on the different forms. But on the other hand, there are passages within the Gospel of Luke you can't explain on that basis. And I think that will be a difficulty that will remain, and maybe so we will never be able to solve the problem about the beginnings of the Old Latin.
Well, that's a note on which I think it's probably a good idea, given the time, to draw the formal business to a close. So what I will do now is I will thank very much our 7 panelists for taking part and for the look back and the look forward which they have offered us. If people are around and would like to stay longer, once everyone has had a chance to be unmuted and applaud the panelists, do stay to continue the discussion. But at this point, thank you to everyone again, and for the very interesting afternoon indeed. And we will meet at the same time next week for the session then. So everyone's unmuted to applaud and thank our panelists as you wish.
Thank you, Hugh.
Thank you very much.